today, planning your transition to a cloud-based GIS. My name is Chris McLeod. I'm a solution architect with Esri Canada, and I'm joined by my colleague today, Simon Bickert.
Good morning, everybody. This is Simon.
A couple of housekeeping things to start off with. We are recording today, and we will send out an email with a link. And please share your thoughts on the presentation on the exit survey. Also, there will be a Q&A panel you'll see in your WebEx screen. Choose Ask All Panelists, type your question, and click Send. We're going to hold off answering questions till the end, but please enter a question at any time. So today's agenda, we've actually split this into two components, which will both work together. So first you will learn about how to create a GIS technology strategy and roadmap, and then you will learn about how to perform a cloud readiness assessment. So first, a GIS technology strategy and roadmap. So essentially, this is an exercise which we feel is important before you dive into the cloud, because it provides an overview of where your organization is at with your GIS. So it contains several components. It provides a current state assessment, a future state vision, and an implementation roadmap to achieve your organizational goals. And the idea is it identifies and addresses high priority operational and governance related requirements over a near-term period, 1 to 3 years. And this will enable your organization to derive greater value from your investments in your GIS. And the outcome will be improved alignment with your organizational and business objectives. And just a note, it's not really a strategic plan. This type of exercise is more focused on near-term gains. So there's really 3 high-level questions to be answered. Very simple questions. Where is the organization at currently? And where does it need to go, and where does it want to go? And what will it take to get there? We find there's a number of common business drivers that organizations will use will be a sort of a common driver for creating a roadmap. And a common one is that GIS adoption or use has plateaued in the organization, and quite often the organization might be seeking advice and validation to help drive growth and change in their GIS. A second common one is a requirement to support digital transformation. So there may be a significant amount of paper-based workflows for inspection, for data collection, and possibly a lot of paper maps being created. And so organizations quite often are looking for guidance on adoption of mobile and web-based workflows to support those digital transformation efforts. A third one is platform and technology migration. So a lot of organizations are looking for guidance on migrating from an older ArcGIS server-based pattern to a newer ArcGIS enterprise platform. So incorporating Portal for ArcGIS, incorporating working with ArcGIS Online perhaps and ArcGIS Enterprise, and also planning for the adoption of new technologies. So cloud, migrating to the cloud, which Simon will be talking about, adding imagery-based workflows, for example, IoT, incorporating sensors and services to support that, and analytics, and this list goes on. And then a fourth one is looking to identify and resolve technical and organizational bottlenecks. So quite often it's helpful to have a intra-organizational exercise to help break down silos and look to promoting more of an enterprise-driven approach. And so this brings us to our first poll of the session. And we're curious which of these criteria would be a priority in your organization for going through the exercise of creating a roadmap. So again, this will take about 30 seconds. GIS adoption use has plateaued in your organization. You may have requirements to support digital transformation. You're looking to perform a platform and or technology migration, or there may be some technical or organizational bottlenecks, or there may be another reason. Okay. Now, when you're putting together a roadmap, there's key considerations, and this is very similar to the people, processes, and technology frame that's often used in IT, but a little more specific here around GIS technology. So when we look at technology strategy for an organization that has a GIS, we're focused on what GIS technology they're using. So what kind of GIS capabilities are they using and do they need? And on the left, the supporting infrastructure. So what type of architectural environments do they need or do they have? And then on the right, what's required within the organization. So the workflows, the resources, the capabilities, the training, all those types of things. So it's very difficult to look at any of these in isolation. When you're putting together a roadmap, you need to consider all these three integrated in combination. So the first component of a roadmap exercise is a current state assessment. And this can include a workshop, a pre-workshop questionnaire. And the questionnaire is intended to collect information to help set the context for the discussion. So information that covers the organization, the architecture, technology, resourcing, things like that to sort of help put together a bit of a picture of the organization before you start having discussions around the current state. And typical topics for discussion can include an outline of the organizational structure, the main business responsibilities, how you work with your data. So how do you manage it? How do you share it, publish it? You want to look at things like your current architecture, applications, databases, and systems, as well as integration points with other systems that could include asset management, CRM, financial systems, things like that. You also want to look at gaps or bottlenecks or pain points in business processes, infrastructure, and resourcing. So this requires a bit of a discussion and exercise to drill into what are the issues in the organization that are hampering growth and hampering adoption of GIS. And then finally, what capabilities would you like to see from a GIS and how important are they? So this is all feeds into implementation planning. And who should participate in an exercise like this? Well, obviously your GIS team, IT, and then key stakeholders from across the organization. So these could be at a managerial level, it could be department heads, and then you may want to bring in other departmental users who are current users of GIS. They could be the power users across the organization, or could be people that are interested in adopting GIS and want to participate in that discussion. Typically, we frame these discussions using the 9 patterns of GIS use, and this is frequently used by Esri. I'm sure you've seen it in other presentations. It's a good way of kind of orienting how you plan for adopting GIS tools and workflows, but not necessarily at a technology level. And so at the top here, we see kind of the foundational patterns, mapping and visualization, and data management. So those are pretty key items that need to be discussed. Then you've got things like field mobility, monitoring, and then newer patterns, or at least patterns that are seeing a lot of growth in technology implementations like analytics. And then other things like design and planning, decision support, constituent engagement, and sharing collaboration. So all of these have implementation patterns in the technology, but it's useful to kind of consider them from this higher level pattern approach to determine what are the priorities for your organization and how best can they be implemented. So when you prepare a current state assessment, like I mentioned, there's these 3 three integral parts of this, and this is a sample of the criteria that you would consider as part of that assessment. So you need to understand the technology landscape. So what GIS products are in use, desktop, web, mobile, like I mentioned, integration with other systems. What's the current licensing, and how are you supporting? What type of support model do you have? So all these are just a sample of the things that you should consider as part of a technology assessment. Down at the bottom under infrastructure, this is really system architecture related. So what type of environments do you have in place? Do you have a publication environment, operational, that type of thing, dev, test, prod? Do you have a security model in place? Do you have a multi-tier security model? Do you have architecture that supports external users and internal users? Have you considered the capacity of your system? Are there issues around capacity? And of course, there's cloud adoption. So if you may have already started moving to the cloud, and how does this factor into your system architecture? On the right-hand side, under the organization, this is where you need to consider how can you sustain and support your GIS program. So do you have sufficient resourcing? Do the resources you have the right capabilities? Are they being trained? Is there attention paid to training? And then finally, up at the top are the workflows. So what are your data management workflows? Do you have a publication strategy? What is the governance? Do you have are you paying attention to data governance? Are there, roles and resources assigned at sort of a data steward, data custodian level? All these things require consideration. So you kind of put all these things together, and you can get a pretty good in-depth assessment of the current state of the GIS in your organization. And this will position planning for a future state and prioritizing what can be achieved. So when we look at a future state, typically we pull out the themes that come out of the current state discussion. So what are the major themes that are of interest to an organization? And so in your case, it could be, it could be mobile, it could be architecture. You may need some to consider licensing. Might be a lot of attention that needs to be paid to data management and your publication workflows. Maybe you're more interested in adding new capabilities. So you're looking at adding, extending your GIS to support new capabilities. And then, of course, there's governance, the governance aspect of that to help sustain your GIS resourcing and training. And then you might want to consider what projects would be required to help this implementation plan. So do you need some proof of concept projects for mobile and for other things? Do you need a kind of a project plan? Do you need, maybe you need some projects around data management. So the projects will kind of help support the implementation planning because you can't really sort of treat these things as abstract. You need some concrete steps to achieve them. And then finally, when you're planning for a future state, you'll have outputs. So when we look at doing an exercise like this, we'll have recommendations categorized by the theme, and then we'll have an implementation plan, and generally short-term, up to 3 years. So out of this will come some summary recommendations, and I've just shown an example here. So we have some recommendations categorized by theme, and we'll look at architecture planning and implementation, and there might be some actual concrete steps here to improve capacity or remove bottlenecks or mitigate maybe some licensing constraints, things like that. You want to sort of schedule how you resolve these issues. And you also want to consider the business benefits of each of these, because everything should be tied to your organizational objectives. So you want to make sure nothing is kind of extraneous or outside how it supports those objectives. A second example here is field mobility. So you might want to understand what you need to how you need to transform your architecture to support field operations. You might need a security model or update your security model to change that. Over on the right-hand side, there's sample ones here around data architecture and management. If you're going to, for example, if you're going to add more mobile workflows, you need to kind of understand how that will change how you manage your data. You might want to look at your services architecture and also consider some governance. Now, all of these things could have their own, consulting engagement or another exercise that goes into much more detail. These are intended to be kind of a summary of kind of the key points, key items that come out of those discussions that will help move your GIS along. And then finally, an implementation plan. So just some sample items here. And so it's a 3-year cycle. We have swim lanes here based on those themes that we talked about a couple slides ago. So resourcing and governance, you might talk about plan for adding specific resources that are required. On the governance side, you might need to establish or reestablish a steering committee. You might look at data governance and standards, things like that. So, and you need to kind of figure out what's the priority for all these items and how are they linked. So what are the predecessors? So I mean, this isn't really a Microsoft project plan, but it's really the same idea. Under software and infrastructure, do you need licensing? Do you need maybe an Advantage program subscription to help support the work you're doing with the infrastructure? Here's a sample. You may, if you're going to create a web GIS and you've decided to go to the cloud, you need to provision that infrastructure. So some sample infrastructure-related implementation items. Down here is training. So obviously there's a big push to ArcGIS Pro coming up. So this is something that we would recommend to all the organizations we work with to prioritize ArcGIS Pro training for their users if they haven't done that already. If they're adopting ArcGIS Enterprise, you want to make sure that the resources that are managing that are properly trained. And then finally, I mentioned earlier about projects. So for example, if you're migrating to the cloud, we would recommend something like a cloud readiness assessment, which Simon will talk about in a minute. To support adopting some of these new workflows, you definitely want to look at adding some, going through the process of proof of concept projects, so field inspection, things like that. So this is just a sample of an implementation plan, a very condensed one, but you can see it's a fairly short life cycle. It's difficult to make plans for technology beyond 3 years, so this seems to be about the right time frame to make these kind of plans and implement them. And of course, you want to keep revisiting these things every year and see how you did in the previous year, and your priorities need to change for the year to follow. So what will you get out of going through an exercise like this? Well, you'll get a focused assessment of where the gaps are in your GIS and where the opportunities are for growth. You'll be able to identify what the key priorities are and what are the steps forward to achieve these priorities. And as we've shown, you'll have a 1 to 3 year implementation plan. So from doing an exercise like this, you should have a pretty good sense of where your GIS is at, the maturity of the GIS, and what steps you need to take to push the GIS forward that make the most sense for your organization. And it's pretty hard to kind of adopt these new technologies, considering the complexity of technology, the training required to not even really consider doing something like this, because it really does help understand, give you a little bit of a plan to move forward. So I'm going to pass it over to Simon here. And just before I do that, let's say I'll just mention a scenario here that would be an example of how it would position to go through a cloud readiness assessment. So, for example, maybe an organization has gone through this roadmap exercise. They're a medium-sized municipality. They've been using ArcGIS Server to support web mapping apps for several years. They're managing their data in an enterprise geodatabase, and the CIO has mandated that any new infrastructure needs to be cloud first. So roadmap recommendations would include creating a new WebGIS publication environment in Azure and engaging Esri Canada to help perform a cloud readiness assessment. And with that, I will hand it over to Simon.
Okay, thanks, Chris. I realized earlier, I said good morning, of course, that's a little bit of Western chauvinism here. I'm in Calgary on a very snowy day today. And yes, once we've looked at the current state and are confident that we understand what our roadmap is for GIS, if this involves cloud, then I think it's one of the next steps that you really need to consider is something that we call a cloud readiness assessment. So before we go into the details of what that is, what is it? If we're going to be doing some sort of a move, for example, like Chris said, the CIO has mandated that your organization is going to be adopting cloud. Maybe it's an all at once, maybe it's a staggered implementation, or maybe as an organization, you've decided that there are advantages to go to the cloud. What is your readiness to be able to enact those changes? Because we want to have a realistic view of this, especially when we're making promises or setting budgets or timelines, making sure that we understand what those challenges in that roadmap are going to be, and so we can plan for them. Now, this might be something that seems like a negative exercise, but it also is important to accentuate that there are going to be opportunities that are provided, depending on maybe some of the limitations that you've been faced with before, around a lot of them around access, field data collection, those sorts of things. Suddenly there are opportunities there, but there also may be limitations that we need to be aware of and be able to chart that on the road forward. So what we want to do is make sure that our roadmap is there, it's a good roadmap, and we want to align that with what are the cloud capabilities of the ArcGIS platform, what cloud providers are you planning to work with, and also what are your business needs. So confluence of those ideas. So I'm going to assume that maybe we have a starting point that's common here. We might already have ArcGIS Enterprise or ArcGIS Server on premises in what we call infrastructure and software setup. That is to say that you as an organization are providing the computers, you're providing the electricity, the storage, everything. So you have a complete responsibility for your GIS stack, and that's represented on the right. Where we see orange filled in cells, that means that it's you as the organization that are responsible for all these things, all the way from making sure you pay your electricity bill, all the way up to the fine tuning of your GIS applications and everything in between. Now, there may be many motivations for making some sort of a move to the cloud, but often one of the opportunities here is to divest some of that responsibility onto others. So, for example, a straightforward move that some organizations are planning is to move from infrastructure that you maintain to moving to infrastructure that another cloud service provider maintains. Now, two of the main cloud service providers that our customers are working with regularly are Amazon with their Amazon Web Services and Microsoft through Microsoft Azure. And in that case, you can see over to the right that the cell for the infrastructure is turned green because now it's the responsibility of Amazon or Microsoft to make sure that all of the data center is operating, the virtual machines are running. And that's that uptime statistics you might have. So what we've done is we've divested some of the responsibility for the stack, but we've also shifted from we have to actually procure this, so we have to have the capital investment, and we're moving it into an operational. So we're paying as you go for infrastructure. So setting up virtual machines in the cloud, virtual networks, setting up your storage accounts. And then on top of that, we're installing ArcGIS Enterprise, and we're configuring it, and we're making sure it's secure, rolling out applications. We still are responsible for a large portion of the ArcGIS stack. So that's infrastructure as a service. Now, platform as a service is not quite as, for ArcGIS, is not quite as common in Canada. The major provider of ArcGIS Enterprise as a service is actually Esri Redlands out of the US. We have had some clients in Canada who have pursued this. And the basic idea here is that Esri works with Amazon to set up the infrastructure, installs ArcGIS Enterprise, configures it, secures it, and then the customer then brings their data, their maps, and their application on top of that. So in some ways, it's very similar to ArcGIS Online in that your responsibilities are reduced very much to the application, your data, and the presentation of it. But it is very bespoke in that this is your ArcGIS Enterprise. It's scaled for you. It's configured for you. And as such, it tends to have higher costs associated with it. And so it's something that it's worth looking into, especially if your needs aren't met by ArcGIS Online and you're not interested in doing infrastructure as a service. It's a nice in-between ground. And then, of course, there's ArcGIS Online, software as a service. So if you've used any of Google's services, Office 365, this is ArcGIS as a service in the cloud. I imagine most of the people on the call have used ArcGIS Online in some capacity before, so I won't go into too much detail. But again, the responsibility of you as an organization is to ensure that your identities are set up, your groups. So at the functional level, you're working with security, but then it's bring your data, bring your services, bring your map, and away you go. So these are sort of the range of possibilities when it comes to working with the cloud and GIS. But like with anything else, sometimes you're dealing with a hybrid. So for example, if your organization is typically an enterprise user and you want to then augment that with ArcGIS Online to expand your capabilities or maybe expand your reach, those are possibilities and that we see all the time. Sometimes we have organizations that can fit entirely within ArcGIS Online. And if that works, then it's usually very cost effective. And there's other organizations who do not adopt any cloud at all. And so those are purely on-premises ArcGIS Enterprise. But quite often, what you want to do is balance what different types of architectures are good at. And one of the things that cloud is good at is scale. So if you have an ArcGIS Online map and it goes viral, there's some sort of an emergency, there's a flood, there's something going on, some news organization picks up, that map will scale if it's been published in ArcGIS Online, whereas your ArcGIS Enterprise might get hammered. So these sorts of considerations about what is each of these things good for is usually a very important part of the conversation of moving to the cloud. Why are we doing this? And what will it do to help us? So if you have a hybrid system, the most common one that we see is a mix of ArcGIS Enterprise, sometimes remaining on premises, and then mixed with ArcGIS Online. You're sharing data between them. You're using each of those for what they're good for. But then there are other types of hybrids. So, for example, if you have ArcGIS Enterprise on premises and you want to spin up maybe a development environment in the cloud, or you want to spin up an analytics environment, we need to have a large amount of hardware applied to a very sticky problem for a short period of time, and then we're going to spin it back down again. So there are many different reasons why you might augment your on-premises GIS with cloud GIS. And maybe you're doing that and you're blending ArcGIS Online as well. Or maybe you're making a full move to the cloud and the data center is being decommissioned and you are going to retain ArcGIS Enterprise, but you're going to put it into maybe Microsoft Azure and you're going to interop with ArcGIS Online. So all of these are different ways that when somebody says, we're moving to the cloud. I say, okay, what do you mean by that? And so that's where I think we get to our poll question here. And you as your organization, so just for everybody, in the WebEx event, the polling tab should have popped up for you. And you got your choice there of, yes, we're planning on moving to the cloud. We're heading out. Or are we moving to a hybrid architecture? Or there's been discussions around the water cooler. Maybe your boss has asked you to start making some recommendations. Or no, our organization is not one of those that's going to be moving, and we're not underway. So got a few more seconds left, I think, on that poll question. No, it's closed now. All right, and I'm looking at the results here, and that breakdown is pretty much what I expected. It really maps well. B was the most common reply. Maybe was the second most common reply. So, yeah, that's interesting to see. Good to know your audience. Chris did touch on the patterns of use, and I can't underline how important it is to understand your GIS before you start uprooting it and moving it somewhere else. There are so many different aspects to it. It's not just some people digitizing in a room with a Sun server anymore. It is usually across an organization. And whenever you've got connections between different parts of the organization, you are going to risk disrupting. So some of these patterns of use really benefit from a move to the cloud. So for example, analytics. If we want to do a big data analysis using the geoanalytics server, spinning up a bunch of VMs with a bunch of CPUs for a short period of time gets that question solved and back in the hands of your analysts in hours instead of days, weeks, or months. Constituent engagement, I already touched on that one. If you have any sort of a public-facing GIS message for your organization, and that could have spikes in popularity, by farming that out to a cloud provider really allows you to scale and be elastic if there's spikes in that usage. Sharing and collaboration. One of the strengths of moving to the cloud is that you're lowering the barriers to collaboration. If your content is available via the web and your collaborators are also available via the web, then that collaboration becomes much easier. So there are opportunities here as well as things that we have to be aware of. And so that's where the meat of the cloud readiness assessment lies. And that is having some structure around that introspection about how are we doing GIS today? How are we going to be able to move a very complex system that often touches maybe as much as 90% of your organization without causing great disruption? Now, because of time constraints today, I can't go into all of these, but I'll be coming back to this list, and I'll be going into a few of them here. So, for example, the database. We'll also talk about the desktop workflows and also look at access management. So database is something that if you traditionally have been using an on-premises SQL Server or even a third-party database SQL Server, and there's this long-standing capability within your organization to use and manage an enterprise geodatabase, then what does that look like when you move to the cloud? What are the constraints? What are the advantages? And both I've listed here for both Amazon and Azure what offerings are supported directly by ArcGIS as a host for a geodatabase. Each one of these has slightly different characteristics. So for example, while an Azure SQL database is very easy to set up, it could very well be that you might run into some performance limitations, or maybe you have other things like compatibility issues because you really customized how your on-premises SQL worked. And so for that, maybe you would want to move to a managed instance or even spin up a VM with a SQL Server database. Now, that's going to be somewhat expensive. The types of VMs that you might select for hosting a SQL Server database, they tend to be quite pricey per hour, and ensuring that everything is backed up is your responsibility. So remember, this is infrastructure as a service here when we're talking about spinning up a VM, as compared to some of the other options, which are platform as a service, where Microsoft is spinning up SQL Server for you, and then you provide the geodatabase inside. So our documentation goes into really good detail as to how to set up each and every one of these, but having that assessment of what is our current capability of moving our DBA knowledge from on-premises to the cloud. Maybe I've been using file geodatabases forever, and this is our first opportunity to move to an enterprise geodatabase. And in which case, things like Azure SQL databases might in fact be a real opportunity to mature your GIS data management. So desktop workflows. Desktop users have a long-standing tradition of, we've got our SDE database, we fire up ArcMap, we connect directly to it, and we do our work. And that has, maybe those patterns have been in place at your organization for decades now. Literally, SDE has been around since the 90s. And to disrupt those types of patterns is something that we really want to make sure that those key users who are providing key productivity, data editing, maintenance of your GIS, doing the most intensive GIS analytics, for example, making sure that those users are able to continue working. And yet, due to the fact that when you lift your data and you're moving it to a cloud, your users aren't also going to the cloud. Your users are going to be here, and their software is still going to be here, but their data is way over there. Depending on where you are in Canada, it could be thousands of kilometers away. And physics dictates that the network between where your users are and where your data is will now have more latency on it. And that means that traditional direct connect from my ArcGIS Pro on my laptop to that enterprise geodatabase in Canada Central data center is not going to be a productive way to move forward. And so there are other patterns here, but each of them really has to be aligned with that technical roadmap. What is it that we're planning to do? So for example, if we are still going to have an on-premises data center and we're moving to a hybrid system, then maybe having an enterprise database on-premises connecting to that and then replicating content to the cloud might work. But if everything is moving, like let's just say we've decided that we're moving everything to databases in the cloud, and our data center is actually going to be burned to the ground. Then you need to figure out how to allow your users who still are in your office to connect to that, and that might be through remote desktop technology, or that might be through feature services, which are very well supported in ArcGIS Pro. And then access management. So taking a really hard look at your organization and how you manage access to your GIS is something that really needs to occur. There are many different ways that a cloud architecture differs from being on premises, but one of the key ways is that you're no longer actually physically in charge of your network. The network is being maintained by Microsoft or by Amazon or by IBM or whoever your cloud service provider is, and you're configuring it, but there's no longer the sense of if you're sitting in our headquarters, you're on the local network, and therefore you're behind the firewall, and therefore you have access to content. And yet, there is this expectation that as you move to the cloud, there is actually not just the same access to content, but improved access to content. I want to be able to access this from anywhere. And so when you're moving away from tools like firewalls and monitoring ingress and egress, you start to turn towards identity. And this is one of the reasons why ArcGIS Online and ArcGIS Enterprise have such a strong emphasis on identity, is that if you're moving from towards a zero trust architecture, then identity is very important to be able to authenticate your users and authorize them with access to content. And so if that is a really big jump for your organization, then we have to look at how are you managing identity currently? Is this something that is compatible with maybe something like Azure AD Connect in order to move that conversation forward? Coming up with concrete steps that would allow you to start to mature and have stronger identity management. Or perhaps you're already doing that already, and this is already something that's taken care of. Well, then that's not a challenge for you. What that will be is, okay, this is an opportunity for us. So depending on, as you've moved through this 10-point assessment of your organization and its readiness, then you can start to identify what are my opportunities as an organization. How is this going to be good and easy? So for example, we want to take advantage of the scalability of the cloud for our outage map for our organization. Great. So that's a definite opportunity. But then we might look at, okay, well, we've got very rigid desktop ArcMap workflows, and we need to really have a think as to who actually needs access to ArcMap so that we can spin up virtual machines for them in the cloud and use remote desktop access. Or maybe we want to do that migration to Pro, as Chris said, and start accessing our content through feature services rather than a direct database connection. So each one of these will provide a concrete step along that roadmap for getting ready for that cloud, for making estimates, for setting timelines. And so that's where the roadmap out of here, the road out of the cloud readiness assessment, is that you want that clear vision. This cloud migration isn't just buzzwords and promises. It really means this. And we know that what our next steps are going to be. And we want to know that those align well with the technology roadmap. Our technology roadmap, our cloud provider's technology roadmap, the ArcGIS technology roadmap, so that we're not heading off in a direction that maybe is not supported in a short period of time, because things are moving very quickly these days. And so that brings me to the end of my part of this talk here. We've gone through, Chris took us through creating that GIS technology strategy and roadmap, and then as one of the potential second acts after that comes a cloud readiness assessment. And I hope that from this talk, you've got an idea of what those two things would look like, and maybe are starting to imagine what those might be able to do for your organization. Some additional resources over and above the ones we've already mentioned. So Esri Canada does have some service packages, and the GIS technology roadmap and the cloud readiness assessment are both listed there. So if you wanted to take a further look into that, as to if you wanted to engage Esri Canada for these, that's the word I'm looking for, tongue-tied, these engagements, I already used that word. So, and then also there's a lot of information from Esri about cloud and about security, because security is a huge aspect of that. And so if you're not already familiar with trust.arcgis.com, I do strongly encourage that you point your browser in that direction at some point. There's a lot of information there that is directed at GIS administrators and those who are coming up with plans to make sure that such a migration would be a secure migration, something that you could move forward with confidence. And speaking of security, of course, ArcGIS Online is going to be switching to HTTPS only this fall. And so there's a video that's actually off of the Trust site that goes over what that might mean for your organization. So as Esri is moving forward with increasing the security of the ArcGIS Online platform, we do want everybody to make the journey with us. And there are some upcoming webinars and events before the year's end that you may or may not be interested in. And also, knowledge is power. Training is important. Chris highlighted that as part of the roadmap. You can bring all the shiny technology that you want, but if you and your users aren't ready to make this kind of a jump, then we really need to emphasize that training is highly important, especially when you're completely changing the fundamentals of how your GIS architecture is working. ArcGIS Online for administrators is something that would allow you to start to think about a hybrid and system architecture design strategies. That allows you to have that deep knowledge of how the ArcGIS enterprise works. ArcGIS Hub, I work with a lot of organizations who, once they've moved into ArcGIS Online, they're using the hub capabilities of ArcGIS Online to really expand and mature their presence there and really create a sophisticated front door for their users. So, on behalf of Chris and myself, thank you for the time, and we'll get to some questions and answers. Chris, have we had some questions rolling in?
We have. Let me have a look here. So there's a couple questions here around the cloud. So I think this one question here was related to the slide you had on the different database types and database services. And so one question is, what if they're using Oracle as their database? What are their options?
Okay, that's a tricky question. Obviously, it's a little bit outside of anything that we can do. But Oracle has a cloud offering themselves where you can set up your geodatabase in an Oracle instance in the Oracle Cloud. Now, this is something that we have seen very few examples of. In one of my clients has been looking into that. But it does pose some interesting challenges when you're designing your cloud roadmap, because while Oracle is a good place, well, at least they advertise it and make the licensing very attractive to move your geodatabase there, most of Esri's tooling around the cloud is focused on Amazon and Azure. And I would say that probably about 90% or more of the cloud work that we've been doing in Canada has been Microsoft focused. And so then you're starting to think about multi-cloud. And so it's something that I think is worth a closer look. The official support for that Oracle Cloud, I don't think it's there yet from Esri. And so it really is a time of transition for Oracle in that. So Chris, a question for you. Who are the typical clients for one of these GIS technical roadmaps?
Well, it could be any type of GIS organization. A lot of them are municipalities, local governments. It could be a larger organization like a provincial government that has multiple departments, and it could be maybe just one department. We've done this kind of work for private organizations. Could be resource sector companies, engineering firms. I mean, I guess the point is it's broadly applicable to any organization that's using GIS or wants to move to enterprise GIS. Let's look at a question for Simon here.
Kind of feels like Christmas morning, people handing out presents.
Okay, here's an interesting one. What percentage of clients have you dealt with that have done the whole platform? Desktop, server, database, the whole shebang?
If we're talking about moving completely to the cloud and burning down and salting the earth of the data center, I think that the number is less than 5 that I've dealt with. And these ones have been very top-down driven initiatives where the entire organization is shutting down their data center and GIS has to go. As far as moving production GIS to the cloud, there are a number of examples, but they're always, in those cases, there's a planned shutdown, but there still are, say, maybe some integrations, some legacy systems that still are in the process of shutting down. So GIS, once it's been determined that it's moving, it tends to move pretty quickly, say within a 12-month period from initial planning. There's great support on Esri's side for that. Okay, so there was a question here for you, Chris, that was, where and when do you plan for the enterprise geodatabase migration? So in that roadmap, if you have to do some sort of a geodatabase migration, is that something that you plan for upfront, or is it something that is down the road a bit?
It's a bit of an open-ended question, but if I understand it correctly, if you're planning to move, let's say you're planning to move from file-based data sets, file geodatabases to a centralized enterprise geodatabase, for example, then yes, I mean that's really a foundational piece of an enterprise GIS, so you would want to prioritize that. Let's look at another question here. I'm actually having trouble scrolling in this window, so I missed some of them.
I was looking here at one that I thought was kind of interesting, because what we've been talking about and is, at the lowest level, that's infrastructure as a service. But this is really a lift and shift. So imagine a lot of organizations already are doing infrastructure as a service, or they're doing virtual machines on premises, so VMware or similar. And there's a question here about Kubernetes. So what we're talking about there is really, that's taking it out of the virtual machine and into a containerized architecture. And there is currently an ongoing beta. This information was announced at the user conference, our virtual user conference in the summer, and that the ArcGIS Enterprise platform is, in fact, there is going to be a third possibility, Windows, Linux, and Kubernetes as a target platform for ArcGIS Enterprise. And while one of those is not like the other, let's just say that. And even at its first release, this is going to be something that I think is for those who already have Kubernetes experience. And until such time as that has matured, I would recommend that if you're looking for a cloud migration, that really if you want to move, do a lift and shift of your virtual machine infrastructure to the virtual machines on the cloud, that is the right path.
And another comment about Kubernetes, from what I understand it, I mean, it's really intended for apps and services that need to scale. So if you're really looking at a limited deployment, or you don't really need to, that's not a major consideration, then maybe Kubernetes is not the best approach. Here's an interesting question. For startup where GIS plays an important part, would you recommend starting with a cloud architecture? So I mean that brings up an interesting point, and there's a bunch of different questions that come out of that. So one question would be, how would you start with a cloud architecture? Like, what would be a good approach there? And another one, I think, especially if you're a small organization or GIS is not necessarily the central part of what you do, but it's part of it, quite often we recommend starting with ArcGIS Online. And I don't know, Simon, if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, definitely. It's depending on the last time you really did a deep dive in ArcGIS Online, you might in fact be surprised at what it can do, because we recognize that ArcGIS Enterprise is the full thing, the full package. And you can basically publish a lot of different things, and you might have very specific needs, and ArcGIS Enterprise is how you get there. And ArcGIS Online, very much like other cloud software as a services, is what Esri provides you is what ArcGIS Online can do. But the thing is that ArcGIS Online has been moving forward with 3 or 4 updates every year for I can't even remember how long. And so it's gotten from the point where you can't do it in ArcGIS Online. Let's default to ArcGIS Enterprise and let's spin up some VMs in the cloud. To let's take a close look, and I think we can actually get this done. And so sometimes with organizations that are thinking about laying out a very large infrastructure, it's like you can do everything that you just described to me in ArcGIS Online. So that is totally an excellent first step, and definitely should be evaluated.
There's a couple questions here around moving. If you're going to set up a WebGIS in the cloud, do you need Portal? Do you need the full ArcGIS Enterprise stack, or could you just use image server, map server, the ArcGIS server, that type of thing? And yes, you can. I mean, you can still, it's still supported. You can create standalone. You can use the role licensing of ArcGIS Enterprise to create a standalone ArcGIS server instance or a standalone image server instance, for example, in the cloud. And we've done that for customers. ArcGIS Enterprise is recommended because you do get benefits with federated server and Portal, and there's a lot of benefits to using the Portal product. But yes, you can use them standalone.
Yeah, I'll say that one of the key differences, and this kind of leads into another question I just spotted here as a security aspect, is that Portal has the ability to hook into SAML-based authentication systems. So Azure AD, for example, or many of the other cloud-based identity providers, whereas standalone ArcGIS server does not have that capability. But then that leads into a question that I think is, it's a bit of a leading question, but does cloud architecture guarantee against cyber attacks or ransomware? And the answer to that is an emphatic no. But one of the nice things about moving to a cloud-based architecture is that you are offloading some of that responsibility. So one of the key differences, for example, between using ADFS, which is Active Directory Federation Services, so the SAML provider for on-premises AD, versus Azure AD, is that Microsoft is managing your Azure AD, and including things such as if you start to get a denial of service attack on your endpoint. So people are trying to overwhelm your password authentications and do a dictionary attack on it, for example, that those things are being monitored for all the time. And it could be that your IT has not set up that kind of monitoring. So offloading some of these security responsibilities and having some of those platform cloud service provider vendor offered assurances do help move in the right direction.
I think it's fair to say, though, that if you are going to move in the IaaS direction, you can never assume that Microsoft will do everything or Amazon will do everything for you. You're still responsible for architecting that environment and managing it. And so, for example, this question comes up like, if Amazon goes down or Microsoft, a data center goes down, for example, and you say, well, it's their fault. Well, not really, because you didn't architect your system to take advantage of geographic redundancy, for example. So there's still quite a bit of responsibility on your part to make sure your system is architected properly.
Yeah, and there's a couple of questions about ArcGIS Online and where's your data is being stored, right? Where is it being stored? And that is, especially with some jurisdictions in Canada, British Columbia included, there are some strict legislation, depending on who you are and what kind of information you're trying to store, as to whether or not that information can be stored outside of Canada. And for those jurisdictions, that has to be part of your assessment. So if you're moving to the cloud and you're choosing to move data to the cloud, then you're restricted to the Canadian data centers for Amazon, Azure, and whichever your provider is. Those are Canadian, but you have to look to make sure that the information that you might store in ArcGIS Online, which is stored in Amazon US West, that information that goes there is allowed to go there. So that is, there are some discussions about being able to control that in the future, but the future's not here yet.
So I think we're just about out of time for questions.
Yeah, and they've been coming in. So thank you very much, everybody. Chris and I will have this set of questions, and we'll be seeing about how to get back in touch with all of you. So I guess from our part, thank you very much for attending this morning, and we'll look forward to speaking to you in the future, perhaps, and seeing you around the internet, maybe on the cloud.
Thank you.